Lisa, thank you so much for that talk. I think that gives us a lot of information and clarity that we have to be armed with and be prepared to talk about, especially right now. As I mentioned earlier, my name's Catherine Huth. I recently graduated at Cal Poly, and I'll be introducing our next speaker. Ying is the president and founder of American Ideals PAC and Defend American Ideals, a 501c4 nonprofit. Both the American Ideals PAC and Defend American Ideals champion America's founding values and traditions. As well as leading these organizations, Ms. Ma has authored her book, Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, a memoir about becoming acquainted with freedom in the inner city of Oakland, California, after leaving post-Mao communist China. Additionally, she hosts the podcast China versus the USA, a show about U.S.-China geopolitical competition, as well as being an active member of the Board of Advisors for the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women, the host of this event. Ms. Ma has advised multiple high-profile national and regional campaigns. In 2021, she served as the communications director for the Elder for Governor campaign in the special recall election in California. And the previous year, she served as communications director for the No on Prop 16 campaign, a movement that struck down an attempt to reinstate race-based affirmative action programs in California that succeeded by a 57 to 43% margin. In the 2016 elections, Ms. Ma served as the deputy director of the Committee for American Sovereignty, a super PAC formed to support the candidacy of Donald Trump for president. During the GOP primaries that same year, Ms. Ma was the deputy policy director and deputy communications director for the Ben Carson presidential campaign. In the past, Ms. Ma served as a visiting fellow to the Hoover Institution of War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University, a premier conservative think tank. She practiced law at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett LLP, a preeminent global law firm headquartered in New York, and managed corporate communications at Sina.com, the first mainland China-based internet company to be listed on the NASDAQ stock market. Following this, she worked on the first professional staff of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission and advised public affairs clients in the Hong Kong office of Burson Marsteller, a leading international public relations firm. Ms. Ma has written widely about politics, conservatism, China, and international affairs. A former contributor to the Wall Street Journal's China blog, she has been published in the Wall Street Journal Asia, the International Herald Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, Fox News, NBC News, Forbes, and other publications. Her on-air commentary has been featured on Fox News, Fox Business, CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, Bloomberg Television, and more. Ms. Ma received her BA in Government magna cum laude from Cornell University and her JD from Stanford Law School. In college, she served as the president of the Cornell Review, a bi-weekly conservative newspaper, and in law school, she was the president of the Stanford's Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies, an organization dedicated to conservative and libertarian legal principles. Also, most notable for the students here, when Ms. Ma was at Cornell, she hosted a lecture with the Clare Boothe Luce Center and brought a rarely heard conservative woman's voice to the Cornell campus while a student herself. Please help me in welcoming Ms. Ying Ma.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. So I have a PowerPoint presentation here. I would say that my experience of campus activism with the Luce Institute when I was in college, that was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. And I'll get to my presentation in a sec, but I'll spend just a minute on this. You guys might have seen that really awful encounter of a federal judge being hectored at Stanford Law School earlier this year. I would say that when I brought my first conservative female speaker to Cornell, where I went to college, it was different, but the same. You know, the rhetoric was different, the topic was different, but the hostility was not. We had cross-dressers screaming at the speaker. And I was 19. I didn't know what to do. We didn't have security because we didn't actually expect any chaos. And so the speaker, Phyllis Schlafly, some of you might know her, a woman of incredible grace, incredible strength. She just smiled through it and persevered. And at one point, the screaming got so loud and the profanity got so offensive, I stood up and told everybody they needed to keep quiet, they needed to be respectful, and that if they had a question, they needed to wait until the Q&A session. And miraculously, everybody did actually comply. They all sort of, they got upset no matter what, but they actually did sort of compose themselves a little bit better. And I tell people that if you are going to engage in campus activism, a lot of things are not fair. You will find there are a lot of situations where you shouldn't have to be the one to stand between a very unruly mob and the speaker, and the campus, the faculty, the administration should be there for you. Oftentimes they're not, and you have to ask yourself whether you're willing to take the risk and actually speak up for the speaker, to actually defend their right to free speech, to defend civility. And you will find that at times it is very dangerous, but at other times it is rewarding because people will realize that they have behaved in ways that are very shameful, and even the loudest, rudest people protesting, hectoring, they might actually sort of have a moment where they think, okay, I should compose myself. This is something that I'm doing that my parents would not be proud of. And I try to tell young people that a lot, because one thing that was a bit disturbing to me about that Stanford encounter, it wasn't just how awful it was also that I didn't see the people who hosted the judge stand up for him. I didn't see them get in front of the crowd and do what they could to sort of interfere with the hectoring. And it's a lot to ask, but unfortunately that is just the time and place and era we live in. But my experience with the Luce Center, it taught me a lot, and I think on that occasion it taught me that there are rewards for taking those risks, for standing up, not just for what you believe in, but standing up for other people, for people who are your guests. And I hope you all get to have much more civil campus debates, and you all will get to have much more fun with speakers on your campus in a very safe way. Now, let me get to my presentation. I know on the agenda it says defeating the woke agenda, but I was actually asked to speak on socialism versus freedom. So I was born in communist China, and I immigrated to inner city Oakland when I was 10. And I think that these days, a lot of people don't quite know what it means to live in a communist country. For some of us, we grew up at a time when there were very strong communist countries around the world, and some of us grew up during the Cold War, where the ideological conflict, the military conflict, and all of that, the competition between freedom and capitalism versus repression and communism, where that was actually front and center. I think a lot of young people these days aren't quite sure what that's all about, and I think it's worth sort of just reminding everybody what sort of system communism is, what sort of system is socialism. And these are the two most famous dictators of socialism, Mao Zedong and Stalin. And this is a very typical communist type of poster, the coloring, the flags, the caption talking about victory and success and how great these men are. Now, communism, whatever it says about what sort of utopia it'll bring to the world, this is probably the most succinct summary of communism's accomplishments. 100 million dead in over 100 years. And note that the biggest number comes from China, 65 million. And that's because China has more people. But the other ones aren't so shabby either. Just in the former Soviet Union alone, 20 million dead. And then you go down the list. Horrific statistics. And so let's take a look back at what communism actually is, or socialism. there are different ways to identify or define this system. I think one way to talk about it is to note what the government can do to you. It takes away your property. It has the right to take away your life. But it's about ownership. Ultimately, it's about who owns what. And in these kinds of systems, the government owns the means of production. It owns the distribution of goods, and that comes with a whole variety of consequences, which we'll talk about. And these are some of the most notable consequences that our friends who are advocating for socialism won't tell you. Starvation, scarcity, appropriation of private property, political persecution, mass murder, and we saw those numbers of people who died in the last 100+ years. And I'm going to skip around this presentation a little bit. And so let's talk about starvation. When the government owns the means of production, when the government owns the means of distribution, oftentimes it's incredibly inefficient. And many of these socialist governments, the way that they went about it, so collectivization of agriculture, both China and the former Soviet Union tried it. And land was confiscated, people were forced to work on the farms in a certain way. And so one of the most notable examples of collectivization is the Great Leap Forward in China, the greatest famine in history, and communes were created, private farms were nationalized, people were told to go and bang on pots so that they could make some sort of industrial products, so farmers started doing that. They ate in canteens instead of cooking in their own homes, and the state determined how they were supposed to make the farms efficient, and in the end it was a massive failure. There was a massive famine, and anywhere between 35 to 45 million died. And there was a similar effort in the former Soviet Union, collectivization. And then you saw famines also elsewhere in other socialist countries. This is one major aspect of how starvation resulted from socialist governments. It's certainly not the only one, but this is one where there was just horrific consequences. There was also political persecution. It kind of went hand in hand. It wasn't just that people had their private property confiscated. It wasn't just that you lost all your personal belongings. You were persecuted if you dared to stand up against the regime. And then there were times when even if you weren't overtly crossing over some kind of political line, but if you belonged to the wrong category, you were persecuted as well. So, for example, landowners were persecuted. Intellectuals were persecuted. In fact, the persecution of intellectuals was a big part of China's Cultural Revolution. And so, once again, you see these horrific numbers of people dying, people having their lives ruined, families shattered. And the USSR had a number of periods where there was a reign of terror. Again, I referred to China's Cultural Revolution, a 10-year period where the entire country was in chaos and about 2 to 3 million people died. And sometimes these people died because their family members turned against them. Their family members were spitting at them in public places, condemning them. Children screaming at their parents, calling them traitors of the cause, traitors of the Red Revolution. And that's what happens when you have a government that turns its people against each other, where an ideology is completely bankrupt but also evil. And so I'm going to skip back a little bit. And so you guys might want to know how I got to the United States. And by now, the reasons for why my family wanted to come probably is self-evident. But I'll give you some additional statistics. In 1980, China's GDP was less than 200, and the USA, which was far less well off back then, our GDP per capita was 12,500. That is massive difference. And so for everybody in China at that time, even if they won't say so out loud to a reporter, they wanted to come to the United States. Even if the government was telling them false narratives about the United States, they wanted to come to the U.S. because they believed that they could get away from all of these problems. And so when I was growing up, I grew up in the city, so I was actually considered lucky in China. And in fact, in a number of socialist countries, if you lived in a big city, you were considered lucky because you didn't have to perform back-breaking farm labor. The people who lived on the farms, usually they had less to eat, they had less resources, their living conditions were far more dire, and that was the case in a number of socialist countries. And in China, so I was one of the lucky few who got to live in the country's third largest city, but this is what I didn't have. No running hot water, no heat, no air conditioning, no color TV, and then you can sort of imagine a list of all the other things. And I was considered amongst the lucky ones in China. And so there was plenty of equality to go around. And so we were just absolutely eager to get out of there. And at the time, quite frankly, we didn't know much about the outside world. We didn't know much about concepts like freedom or democracy, but we did know what we did not have. And I show you these pictures of all the brands you might see at a regular grocery store here in the United States. Some of them didn't exist when I was living in China. But my point is that the United States had shelves full of goods, options. You know, you didn't just have one kind of ice cream. You had just Haagen-Dazs has multiple kinds of ice cream. Baskin-Robbins has is it 57 flavors? And you don't just have water. You have zero water. You have smart water. You have this and that. And that's what capitalism gives you. It gives you choice. It gives you a free market where people can compete for your dollars. And when I was growing up in China, it was very common to walk into a store and see the shelves all being empty. And then sometimes, even if they had the goods, you would have to inquire with the clerk, and then she would sort of rummage around and then pull out a product in some cabinet that was locked and hidden away. And I mean, China's very different today, obviously, compared to when I was growing up, but socialism and its command of the economy and its repression, it made it impossible for the free market to flourish, and it made it impossible for all of these goods to become available to its citizens. And so these goods, or the prospect of these goods, that was one of the major reasons why my family came to the U.S. And of course, once we've come, we found many, many more goods. One of my happiest memories was showing up in the United States and tasting all kinds of different ice cream flavors, and going to McDonald's, because that didn't exist in China back then. And I think for those of us who live in a country with that sort of material abundance, we don't realize that in our lifetime, there are countries, in fact, even today, there are countries that don't have that. I mean, think about North Korea, which suffers under a communist, ruthless dictatorship. The people there still don't have this sort of abundance. Now, I'll share a little bit more about my own story in China, and because I always find that people can relate to stories a little bit better than all the statistics. So when I was in kindergarten, this was during an era where China was beginning to open up. It still was very poor, but it was after the Cultural Revolution in China, made a decision to open up to the West, and foreigners had started to trickle in. And one of our relatives who lived in Hong Kong came to visit and brought us some nail polish. And I was the beneficiary of that gift. And I had never seen it, didn't know what nail polish was, but then once I was introduced to it, I fell in love with it. I painted my nails. I went to kindergarten. And there was a frenzy because nobody else in my kindergarten had ever seen anything like that. And people started asking me for nail polish. And of course, I didn't bring an actual bottle of nail polish with me to kindergarten, so I couldn't give any of it to them. What I ended up doing was, as the nail polish started to flake, obviously this wasn't me getting a fancy nail, my nails done at a salon where the nails would last for a good while. This was very flimsy stuff. So as the nail polish started to flake, I started to give them out as sort of a handout. And so that was my way of giving out the nail polish to people who wanted it. And it was a very sought after commodity. And the boys wanted it. They didn't know what it was. The girls wanted it. And then, but soon I ran out, and then I started playing favorites, like I had friends I favored. And I didn't have any enemies, but I couldn't give out nail polish flakes to everybody. So some people didn't get them and some people were kind of upset. So I was at a kindergarten where I was there for an entire week. I went home every weekend. I didn't go home every day. And so in the middle of the week, one of my instructors came to me and asked me to please stop painting my nails from then on. And I was so dumbfounded, because I felt very special. I had some nail polish to give out. I felt like I was the queen or something. And she explained, and she had always liked me, and I had liked her a lot. And she explained that not everybody else had nail polish, and that I was creating way too much of a havoc in class. And actually what happened was, I forgot this part. For those who didn't get my handout, they started using crayons to paint their nails. And it was, I didn't feel particularly sad about it, but in hindsight, it's terrible. Children shouldn't have to do that. Everybody should have enough. And so the instructor said to me, look, it's become such a mess. The kids are upset, and then they're coloring their own nails with these crayons. So the best solution is you got to give up your nail polish. And I did, because we couldn't find any other way. And it was, China didn't have nail polish. Not for the kids, not for the adults. The teacher who asked me to give up my nail polish, she had never had her nails painted before. I wasn't going to go offer her any nail polish flakes, but I think she understood, and in China, the school system is very different. You revere your teachers. They don't ask you for favors. They just tell you what to do. And what I remember a lot about this incident was the teacher took me aside, had a very serious conversation with me, and it was as if she was asking me for a favor. And in my experience in China, the adults don't ask you for favors. They just tell you what to do. And when she asked me for a favor, I felt compelled to at least consider it seriously. But that was the strangest moment for me, and I didn't understand why nail polish was such a big deal. But all these years later, China now has plenty of nail polish. I don't even paint my nails these days, even though I've got every opportunity to do it and I've got the means to do it. But I tell this story because, one, you don't have that choice. If you want to paint your nails, you don't have nail polish. If you don't want to paint your nails, you don't have nail polish either. And that was the China I grew up in. And then in order to keep everybody pacified, somebody had to give up their belongings because everybody else got upset. I asked earlier today, I asked Margie a question about jealousy. I think in this case in my kindergarten, it wasn't a case of jealousy. It was, I think everybody, as young as we were, all my little friends, I think we all sort of inherently comprehended that something was not quite right. That, that Ying hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't done anything to anybody, but we just didn't have enough. And it was something that we all wanted to have. And maybe some of the boys needed to go home and talk to their parents about how, boys back then, you just weren't supposed to paint your nails. But that's a separate question. And I think it sort of and it's such a minor thing, right? We're not talking about people starving. And there were plenty of people who were starving. We're not talking about people going to jail. And there were plenty of people who were thrown in jail for no good reason. But this is a minor material possession. And we didn't have it. And it was because of the political system that we lived under, and it was because of the economic system that we lived under. And I don't think anybody who talks about socialism these days should forget that. And I think one danger is that people do forget that these days, and especially the folks who are advocating for socialism in America. It's not fun. I assure you, it is not fun. And that is why so many people from socialist countries want to come here. I'm going to skip over some of these slides because I know we're running low on time. One of the most shocking things and disappointing things is that the idea of socialism is becoming more popular in America now. And this is a poll that was done in 2021, so it's from a couple of years ago. But there's a very significant percentage of young people who view socialism favorably. There's nothing favorable about it. We should not kid ourselves. And I think, to be fair to people on the other side, when they advocate socialism, and Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont is a very key advocate of it, they're not talking about taking away, bringing in a bunch of armed guards to take away your property, to lock you in jail. They're talking about something very different. They're not talking about collectivization of farmland in the United States. They think that they could do this in a civilized way, and they think they can just give out a massive number of goods and services to people for free. And so you'll find that they're often talking about free education, free healthcare, free this, free that, and so a very common list of goods they talk about. Here's a very short list: free college for all, free early childhood education, and a very high minimum wage guaranteed by the federal government, and so you'll find that they talk about that a lot, and they'll say that they're advocating for democratic socialism. They'll tell you that they're not advocating for the communism that I left, the communism that you see in North Korea today. And but I think it is very important to make that distinction, but it is also very important to know what are the consequences of the policies that they are trying to advocate, because they're always telling you that they don't want to be communist China, they don't want to be North Korea, they don't want to be Cuba, they want to be the Nordic countries. That is, their example of the success of socialism. Now, the Nordic countries have a bit of a problem with that rhetoric, because they say, we're not a socialist country. Please get your facts straight. And so here is the former Danish prime minister. He went around telling, and at a time when the United States kept saying, we're for socialism, and we want the kind of socialism that Denmark and the other Nordic countries have. And the prime minister said, we don't have socialism. Please please understand that we're actually a market-based economy. And now their government, their system of government is also very different from ours. So if you want to advocate for policies that these Nordic countries have, it is very important to know what sort of consequences and what sort of differences we're talking about. One of the key differences is a massively higher tax rate compared to what we have here in the United States, the kind of tax rates that most Americans would be absolutely unwilling to pay. And so, they have a lot of sort of social security, the social welfare benefits. Those are paid for, but you also have to remember that there is a catch. And what is the catch? The taxes are extraordinarily high. Just an example, sales tax. We go to a store, maybe our sales tax, state plus whatever state sales tax, about 7% or so. In Denmark, it's, about 25%. That's, imagine if you go to the store, buy $100 of goods, and every time you pay $25 to the government. And that's not it. I mean, there are look at their excise duties for cars. And then, if you think about just who bears the cost of these higher taxes policies, it's the middle class. The middle class pays a very hefty portion of it, and you do get lower living standards. You get scarcity of care, and it is important to remember that you have less choice, and you have lower economic output. And here's an example of a Canadian senior facing Canada's healthcare system, because one of the things that people here in the U.S. talk about is how much they admire Canada's healthcare system, and they want us to have that too. This is a senior who had health problems, and she wanted a colon screening, a colonoscopy, and she was told by the Canadian health system, you've got to wait. We just, we've got to prioritize. We've got younger people. And she couldn't get one, and 6 months later, she was hemorrhaging, and she ended up, after she got a colonoscopy, she died shortly thereafter. And what is so sad about this story is that she's actually the mother of someone that some of us know, Sally Pipes, president of the Pacific Research Institute, a woman who's widely admired, widely respected across the country. And this is and she's from Canada, and this is a story that she has told and it's just, it sort of brings home what these so-called socialized socialized medicine is supposed to bring to you, because it's not, you don't just get it for free and then you go to the hospital and you don't ever have to pay for anything and it's hunky-dory. Somebody is ultimately paying. There's always money that's gonna, there's never enough money. You're always gonna run out of it. And in the end, if the government gets to prioritize, there are people like this elderly woman who doesn't get the care that she should, not in a timely manner. I believe I'm running low on time, so I'll skip through some of this. Here's AOC, another very prominent proponent of socialism in the United States, and here she is talking about climate change. And this was a few years ago, and she was warning people about how she doesn't even feel comfortable maybe having children because more people on the planet, more carbon emissions, and that's not good for the planet. And so young people all need to be very, very worried about that. And I didn't know how crazy, I didn't know how much that sort of thought permeated through younger people until I was in New York recently and hung out with the teenage daughters of one of my friends. And they actually have heard that, and they actually take it very, very seriously. But I would point out that this link, I think what is so absurd about it is that communists or socialists, they all think that human dignity is something that you can just quantify. And so at the bottom, I talk about a minister, a very senior minister from China, who went around the developing world sort of teaching the developing world how to combat climate change. And she said, well, we had so many forced abortions in China in those decades, and that means 100 million birds, and a reduction of 1.83 billion tons of carbon emissions. And it's only a socialist minister who can say that with a straight face without understanding just how horrific that sounds. But that's because they don't have a concept of human dignity. They think that it's all a bunch of numbers, and that if a bunch of babies get killed, we'll just quantify it in how we've saved the earth. And China, you guys may have heard about this, for decades, they had a forced abortion policy, a one-child policy, and so if you wanted to have more, you couldn't. And there were exceptions to the policy, but in general, it was enforced with a tremendous amount of brutality. And that is the face of socialism as well. And for them to actually shamelessly go around the world promoting it, and for AOC to kind of chime in and talk about, whoa, I can't have a baby because, it might harm the planet. It sort of tells you just how absurd a lot of this is. And I think it's important to remember that human dignity matters. the equality of opportunity matters, and freedom and democracy matters. Capitalism brings wealth and opportunities, and let's also remember that none of that is a guarantee. There are no guarantees in a free country. You have to make your own choices, and sometimes those choices don't pan out, but you get to choose, and that is something that you don't get under a socialist country. At the very least, your choices will be highly limited. So I will end there, but I think that we live in a country with great material abundance, with a lot of with a great deal of opportunities, and so as mad as things appear, lots of people from less fortunate places still want to come here. But let's remember that when we're advocating for social change, that we don't go the route of socialism, and we understand what socialism actually means. So with that, I'll take a few questions. And I probably should ask, I've kind of lost track of time, so I don't want to go over time. How many questions do I have? Okay. All right, great.
Okay, I'm Isela. I'm from Biola University. I'm actually from Oakland as well.
Oh,
I'm from East Oakland, and I went to Oakland Technical High School. I just wanted to ask, we know our city. It's like very left, and I feel like there's no hope to turn that around, and it's extremely socialist. Mm-hmm. And I think that I don't think that we'll ever learn to get away from that until we go through it. Unfortunately, in our city, there's a lot of homeless. There's a lot of people who are going bankrupt. There's a lot of people who are losing their homes. They can't be homeowners anymore, and it's kind of like, don't be a homeowner, because that means you're a supremacist, or that means you're above these other people who are in the lower income side of Oakland. But I was wondering if there's any hope for my city, but yeah.
I think there's always hope, but I share your frustration about Oakland, and it's one reason why I left and then extracted my family from Oakland, and it seems to have gotten worse since my family left. I think Oakland sort of exists in the wider context of California, which is that a lot of things are going downhill in California as well. We've seen a mass exodus of residents from the state. We've seen uncontrollable crime. We've seen homelessness spiraling out of control. The cost of living has gone up tremendously. And I think here's where I see a sliver of hope, which is that all these super leftist policies have inflicted massive harm on everybody, including people on the left. And it is no longer, bad governance is no longer a partisan issue. And my hope is that sensible liberals will realize that it is time for change, that it is time for new leadership, whether on the state level or on the local level. So, for instance, recently in Oakland, I know a bunch of businesses closed to protest the high crime rate. And I bet you that a lot of those business owners are not Republicans or conservatives. I think they just got tired of the crime that has gone unaddressed. And my hope is that people like that, sensible people who want to make a living, who just want to live in peace, people like that in Oakland and across the state will come together and actually demand real change, and that change will happen not on a partisan level of any kind, but that will actually get efficient government, good government, strong leaders. I'm not seeing anybody in the horizon who can deliver that, and so it is oftentimes very frustrating to look at not just cities like Oakland, but the California state legislature in general. But perhaps when all the rich people in Silicon Valley and people in Hollywood and elsewhere, when they can't get around from point A to point B without being threatened, when regular citizens can't make a living, perhaps we will be forced to actually make some real changes, and I hope that day comes sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alexandra. I go to Irvine Valley College. And like you said in your presentation, how there are a lot more young people that are in favor of socialism, wanting free healthcare, wanting free food, things like that. What do you think caused the decline in people not wanting to work hard anymore and losing passion in their work?
Most likely it's because we as a society hasn't emphasized it as much, because a lot, and I do see this in younger people, including the ones who apply for jobs with me or work with me. Some of them are still great, but some of them sort of feel entitled to not working very hard. For instance, on a campaign some years ago, I supervised a young lady who, and I was one of the senior communications people on that campaign, and this young lady, as a member of this communications team, she couldn't write. She was very inarticulate, and she didn't come to work. Now, that last part was the part that bugged me the most, because the other two things, I feel like if you are willing to work hard, I'm happy to train you, I'm happy to help you become a better writer, help you become a better communications professional. But she felt she didn't have to come to work. And I think part of it, I think, is generational. Part of it may have something to do with social media. I think a lot of people have gotten, and I would say people we can see in the public sphere, you see all these young influencers with millions of followers, maybe tens of millions of followers, and they live such a glamorous lifestyle. And they don't have to show up at an office from 9 to 5 and slave away. That probably has something to do with changing our culture as well. And I also think that just in general, you look around, our leaders don't put an emphasis on that anymore. I mean, look at all the riots that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement, the protests in 2020. Our entire country practically was on fire for about 6 months or so. Now, I'm pretty sure that those people who did the looting and the rioting and injuring cops, I don't think they had a very strong concept of work. I don't think they believed in it, aside from the fact that they didn't believe in law and order, but it doesn't seem like they believed in the concept of work either. And most of them were never punished. A lot of them got away. And I think that had a lot to do with our political leadership as well. And so it's very sad to see. I think that there are values that our political leaders should emphasize, and I do think it makes a difference. But at the moment, it's sort of a sad state of affairs. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ying. We're going to have a short 10-minute break, and then we're going to hear from Abby Johnson. Thank you.